Two gunshots echoed through the church, shattering the peaceful atmosphere. Darius Wilkins, an 18-year-old with a bright future, collapsed in the pews, fatally shot. His father, the preacher, knelt over his body, whispering a prayer. The congregation was thrown into chaos, their screams filling the air as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Detective Tyrone Robinson, a seasoned investigator with the Minneapolis police force, was called to the scene. His calm demeanor and sharp instincts made him the perfect candidate to unravel the mystery that had left the town in shock. As he stepped into the church, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. This was no ordinary case. This was a crime that had struck at the heart of community. The investigation began with a series of interviews, each one revealing a piece of the puzzle. The parishioners recounted the events of that fateful morning, speaking of the choir's powerful rendition of Amazing Grace, the sudden chaos that erupted with the sound of gunshots, and the desperate attempts to save Darius. But no one could provide a clear picture of the shooter. It was as if the person responsible had vanished into thin air. Before we continue with this twisted tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We would love to know how wide our videos get. In the heart of North Minneapolis, there was a place where the spirit of community thrived. Grace Baptist Church was more than just a building. It was a sanctuary, a beacon of faith for those who found solace within its walls. The church was a place where families gathered, where friends laughed, and where the warmth of fellowship filled the air. It was a tight-knit community, bound together by shared beliefs and a deep sense of belonging. Pastor Quentin Wilkins was the embodiment of this community's values. He was a man of unwavering faith, respected and revered by all who knew him. His sermons were powerful, his presence commanding. He was a pillar of moral authority, guiding his congregation with wisdom and compassion. To many, he was the very essence of righteousness. Yet, within this community, there was a young man whose journey would challenge the very foundations of their beliefs. Darius Wilkins, once known as Daniel, had embarked on a path of self-discovery. He was a proud trans man, embracing his true identity with courage and determination. Darius was a bright light, a beacon of hope for others who struggled to find their place in the world. His transformation was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Family photos capture the essence of Darius's journey. In one, a young child with a bright smile, eyes full of wonder. In another, a teenager, eyes reflecting a growing sense of self-awareness. And then, the most recent photos, showing a young man who had found his true self. Each image was a step in a journey that was both personal and profound. The church services were a place of joy and celebration, where the congregation came together to sing hymns of praise and seek guidance. The sound of their voices filled the hall, a harmonious blend of faith and hope. But amidst the familiar melodies, there was a tension that few could see. Darius's college halls were a world away from the church, a place where he could explore his identity freely. The halls were filled with the energy of young minds, each one on their own path of discovery. It was here that Darius found support and understanding he needed to embrace his true self. His college life was a stark contrast to the traditional values of his upbringing, a place where he could be himself without fear. But beneath the hymns and sermons, a storm was brewing, one that would explode on a quiet Sunday morning. The tranquility of the church was about to be shattered, and the lives of those within it would be forever changed. The journey of Darius Wilkins was about to collide with the deeply held beliefs of his community, setting off a chain of events that would test their faith and their understanding of what it means to truly love one another. The morning had begun like any other, with the familiar sounds of the congregation gathering, the soft murmur of greetings, and the anticipatory hush that precedes the start of the service. The choir, a group of dedicated souls who brought the house to life with their voices, was in the midst of a powerful rendition of Amazing Grace. Their voices soared, filling the sanctuary with a sense of unity and purpose. It was a moment of pure connection, a time when the worries of the world seemed to fade away. But then in an instant, everything changed. The choir reached a crescendo, their voices blending into a harmonious peak, when the sound of gunfire shattered the peace. Two sharp cracks echoed through the hall, cutting through the music like a knife. The congregation, caught off guard, reacted with a mixture of confusion and terror. Panic set in as people scrambled for cover, some diving behind pews, others rushing for the exits. The once serene atmosphere was now filled with chaos and fear. Darius Wilkins, who had been sitting in the third row, was struck twice in the back. The force of the bullets knocked him from his seat, and he collapsed to the floor, his body lifeless. The congregation, still in shock, could only watch in horror as the young man they had known and loved lay there, motionless. The pastor, Quentin Wilkins, moved with a sense of urgency, stepping around the pulpit and making his way to his son, kneeling beside Darius. He began to pray, his voice trembling with emotion. "Lord, take the soul of this lost one," he whispered, his hands resting gently on his son's head. In the midst of the chaos, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching. The 911 calls had been made, and first responders were on the scene in a matter of minutes. Paramedics rushed in, their training kicking in as they assessed the situation, and began their efforts to save Darius. But it was clear that the young man's injuries were severe, and the chances of survival were slim. Detective Tyrone Robinson arrived shortly after, his years of experience on the Minneapolis police force evident in the calm and composed manner in which he took control of the scene. He moved through the chaos with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the room for any clues that might help him understand what had happened. As he approached the fallen Darius, he could see the pain and confusion etched on the faces of the congregation. This was a community in shock, struggling to comprehend the violence that had just taken place within their sanctuary. Forensics began their initial analysis, working methodically to gather evidence. They found 9mm shell casings on the floor, a clear indication of the type of weapon used. The trajectory of the bullets was a critical piece of the puzzle, and the team worked quickly to determine the angle and origin of the shots. They interviewed witnesses, piecing together their accounts of the events. The congregation, still in a state of shock, provided their testimonies, each one adding a layer to the unfolding mystery.
But as the evidence began to accumulate, Detective Robinson realized that the clues weren't adding up. Witnesses claimed the shots came from the back of the church, but the science told another story. The trajectory of the bullets, the position of the shell casings, and the location of the wounds on Darius's body suggested a different origin. It was a discrepancy that raised more questions than it answered, and Robinson knew that he had a long road ahead of him in solving this case. The church, once a place of peace and worship, was now a crime scene, its halls filled with the hum of activity as the investigation continued. The congregation, still reeling from the events, gathered in small groups, offering each other comfort and support. It was a community that had been torn apart by violence, and the road to healing would be a long and difficult one. But as Detective Robinson delved deeper into the case, he knew that uncovering the truth would be the first step in bringing some semblance of closure to this shattered community. As the dust began to settle in the aftermath of the unthinkable, Detective Tyrone Robinson found himself at the center of a whirlwind of emotions and conflicting testimonies. The church, once a sanctuary of peace, was now a hive of activity, with officers and forensic experts moving with purpose. The air was thick with the weight of unanswered questions, and the detective knew that the path to the truth would be anything but straightforward. The first wave of interviews brought forth a chorus of voices, each one painting a picture of the chaos that had erupted during the service. Deacon Johnson, a man of few words but unwavering faith, recounted the moment with a heavy heart. "We heard the shots from behind," he said, his voice trembling. Everyone was looking at the choir, and then, it was like a nightmare. Mrs. Harris, a Sunday school teacher with a kind face, echoed his sentiments. "I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the door slamming shut." Their accounts were consistent, yet something gnawed at Robinson's instincts. There was a disconnect, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. As he delved deeper, Robinson found himself standing at the threshold of a family in turmoil. Alicia Wilkins, Darius's mother, was a picture of grief and confusion. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, held a flicker of something more complex than mere sorrow. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, her words halting and evasive. "Darius was a good boy," she began, her gaze drifting to a photograph of her son on a nearby table. "He was always kind, always helping others." But as she continued, her voice wavered. He changed. He was searching for something, I think." The detective's eyes softened with empathy, but his mind remained sharp. He sensed that Alicia was holding back, that there was more to the story than she was willing to share. And so he pressed gently, coaxing her to reveal the truth. It was then that he discovered a crucial piece of the puzzle. Darius had been transitioning. He had kept this part of his journey hidden from his father, fearing the reaction it might provoke. Flashbacks began to weave their way into the narrative, painting a picture of the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the Wilkins household. Alicia, ever the protector, had been the one to shield Darius from his father's wrath. She had hidden the hormone prescriptions, slipping them to her son in secret. Whispers of confrontation filled the air, as father and son danced around the unspoken truth. Quentin Wilkins, a man of unwavering faith, had been grappling with his own demons, torn between his love for his son and his deeply held beliefs. Detective Robinson wasn't just solving a crime, he was stepping into a family at war with itself. The lines between love and duty, acceptance and tradition, were blurred. As he pieced together the fragments of this shattered family, he realized that the truth was far more complex than he had initially imagined. The church, the community, and the family, all were bound by a web of beliefs and values that had been tested to their breaking point. And so, the investigation continued, each new revelation bringing with it a deeper understanding of the forces that had led to that fateful Sunday morning. As the investigation into the tragic events at Grace Baptist Church unfolded, Detective Tyrone Robinson found himself relying on the cold, hard facts that forensic science could provide. The chaotic accounts of the congregation, the palpable grief of Darius's family, and the lingering questions about the shooter's identity all needed to be grounded in concrete evidence. And so, the forensic team set to work, meticulously analyzing every detail of the crime scene. The first breakthrough came from the bullet trajectory analysis. The forensic experts carefully measured the angles and distances, tracing the path of the bullets that had taken Darius's life. What they discovered was both surprising and significant. The trajectory suggested that the shots had been fired from an elevated position, aligning perfectly with the pulpit. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle, one that contradicted the initial witness accounts of the shots coming from the back of the church. Further examination of the pulpit revealed another telling clue. On the inside of the pulpit wall, forensic experts discovered faint traces of gunpowder residue. This was not a random find. It was a clear indication that a weapon had been fired from this very spot. The evidence was mounting, and it pointed in a direction that no one had initially considered. The type of weapon used was also a critical piece of the investigation. The bullets recovered from the scene were identified as 9mm caliber, a common choice for many firearms. But it was the specific make of the gun that provided the next big break. The forensic team determined that the weapon used was a Glock, a popular and reliable handgun. This was a significant detail, one that would help narrow down the search for the weapon and its owner. Robinson's instincts told him to dig deeper into the background of the church and its members. It was during this phase of the investigation that he uncovered a startling fact. Records showed that Pastor Quentin Wilkins had recently purchased a 9mm Glock. The timing was suspicious, and the detective knew that this was a lead he needed to follow up on. The search for the weapon itself was a race against time. Robinson and his team scoured the area around the church, looking for any sign of the missing gun. It was a painstaking process, but their efforts eventually paid off. In a city park pond, not far from the church, divers discovered a Glock 19 handgun, partially buried in the muddy bottom. The weapon was retrieved and sent for forensic analysis, where it was conclusively traced back to Pastor Wilkins. The evidence was now undeniable. The bullet trajectory, the gunpowder residue, and the weapon itself all pointed to one conclusion. The shots that had taken Darius's life had been fired from the pulpit, and the gun had been in the possession of the pastor. The truth wasn't hiding in the shadows, it was standing under the spotlight, in plain view for all to see. As Robinson pieced together the final elements of the investigation, he couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of human nature. The pastor, a man revered for his faith and moral authority, had become the center of a tragic and shocking crime. The investigation had uncovered a web of secrets, lies, and ultimately, a desperate act driven by deeply held beliefs. Detective Tyrone Robinson stood in the quiet of the church. He had seen many crime scenes in his years on the force, but this one struck a different chord. The sanctity of the church had been violated, and the man he was about to confront was someone he had admired from afar. Pastor Quentin Wilkins was a figure of respect, a man whose sermons had moved many to tears. But now, he was a suspect in a heinous crime. Robinson took a deep breath and approached the pastor, who sat alone in the front pew, his head bowed in prayer. The detective's voice was calm but firm as he began the questioning. "Pastor Wilkins, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here today." The pastor looked up, his eyes red from crying, but there was a resoluteness in his gaze that made Robinson's heart sink. "I know what you're going to ask," the pastor said, his voice steady. "I did it. I had to." Robinson's mind raced. He had expected denial, perhaps even anger, but this confession was unexpected. "Why, Pastor?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Why did you feel you had to take your son's life?" The pastor's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "He was lost," he said, his words heavy with sorrow. "I had to save him." Robinson listened intently as the pastor began to explain. He spoke of his deep faith, of his belief that he was doing God's work. He compared himself to Abraham, who had been willing to sacrifice his own son at God's command. "I believed God told me to cleanse the sin," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I was saving his soul." As the pastor spoke, Robinson's mind flashed back to the sermons he had heard over the years. The fiery words on sin, the indirect jabs at what he had called abomination, the mounting pressure he had felt to uphold the values he believed in. It was clear that the pastor had been struggling, torn between his love for his son and his unwavering belief in his faith. The detective couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man sitting before him. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was a tragedy born out of a father's torment, a man lost in his own convictions. The pastor's actions were unforgivable, but the pain behind them was palpable. Robinson's thoughts drifted to Darius, a young man whose life had been cut short by the very man who was supposed to protect him. He thought of Alicia, Darius's mother, whose grief was compounded by the unimaginable betrayal. And he thought of the congregation, their faith shattered by the actions of their leader. As the pastor continued to speak, Robinson realized that this case was more than just a crime investigation. It was a story of a family torn apart by conflicting beliefs, a community shattered by violence, and a man who had lost his way in the name of faith. The motive wasn't as simple as hatred or greed. It was a complex web of fanaticism, love, and a desperate attempt to cling to what he believed was right. As the dust settled on the tragic events at Grace Baptist Church, the small community of North Minneapolis found itself thrust into the national spotlight. The trial of State versus Quentin Wilkins became a media sensation, with reporters from across the country descending on the town to cover every detail of the proceedings. The case was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a symbol of the broader struggles facing communities everywhere. The trial was a somber affair, filled with emotional testimonies and heart-wrenching accounts of the events that had unfolded on that fateful Sunday morning. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven by a dangerous mix of fanaticism and intolerance, while the defense argued that Pastor Wilkins had acted out of a misguided sense of duty and love for his son. In the end, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a measure of closure to some, but for others, it only deepened the divide. Grace Church, once a cornerstone of the community, was forced to shutter its doors. The congregation was left in disarray, with some members mourning the loss of their spiritual leader, while others defended him as a man who had acted in accordance with his deeply held beliefs. The community was split, and the wounds would take time to heal. In the wake of the trial, Alicia Wilkins made a difficult decision. She left town, seeking a fresh start and a way to honor the memory of her son. In Darius's name, she created an LGBTQ+ support group, a place where others could find the understanding and acceptance that had been so cruelly denied to him. It was a small but powerful act of defiance, a way to turn a tragedy into something positive and transformative. Detective Tyrone Robinson, who had been deeply involved in the investigation from the beginning, found himself reflecting on the case long after it had been closed. He had seen his fair share of murder and violence, but this case had left a lasting impression on him. "I've seen murder," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of sadness and determination. "But this one stays with me." The case of State versus Quentin Wilkins became more than just a legal battle. It was a story of a community divided, a mother transformed, and a young man whose life was cut tragically short. It was a reminder of the power of faith, the dangers of fanaticism, and the importance of understanding and acceptance. As the town of North Minneapolis began the long process of healing, the memory of Darius Wilkins lived on, a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Religious extremism had always been a shadow lurking at the edges of society, a force that could turn faith into a weapon. In the case of Darius Wilkins, it had manifested in the most heartbreaking of ways. A man who was supposed to be a beacon of love and guidance had instead become a figure of fear and oppression. The line between faith and fanaticism had blurred, and in its wake, a young life had been lost. Transphobia, too, had played its part in this tragedy. It had been masked as morality, cloaked in the language of sin and salvation. The pastor's sermons, filled with fire and brimstone, had created an atmosphere of fear and intolerance. Darius, a young man seeking to live his truth, had been met with resistance and condemnation. His journey of self-discovery had been met with hostility, and in the end, it had cost him his life. The deadly consequences of silence and shame were also laid bare. The secrets that had been kept, the conversations that had never happened, these had all contributed to the tragedy. In a world where acceptance and understanding were so desperately needed, silence had only deepened the divide. The pain of being rejected, of feeling unworthy, had driven Darius to seek solace in places where he could be himself, free from judgment. As the community of North Minneapolis began to heal, the legacy of Darius Wilkins lived on. His story became a poignant reminder of the importance of empathy and compassion. It was a call to action, a plea for a world where everyone could live their truth without fear of retribution. The pain of his loss was a wound that would take time to heal, but it also served as a catalyst for change. In the end, the story of Darius Wilkins was a lesson unlearned. It was a stark reminder that faith, when twisted by intolerance and fear, could become a destructive force. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a call to all of us to examine our own beliefs and actions. Darius had wanted nothing more than to live his truth, to be accepted for who he was. But the one man who should have protected him, who should have loved him unconditionally, had believed that he had to kill him. And in that belief, we are all left to ask, when does faith stop guiding us and start destroying us?